Thank you, Andy, and thank you everybody for turning out, especially after the threatening weather we experienced early today. It's always good to be back in Monroe. The first time was in 1978 when I came out here as a boyish graduate student to research my master's thesis, which ended up becoming my first book. And what you'll hear tonight is a product of additional research on that subject. On April 16, 1864, as the Army of the Potomac prepared for a spring drive against Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, Major James Harvey Kidd of the 6th Michigan Cavalry wrote a letter to his father. Over the past 2 years, the North's largest field army had mounted similar efforts to capture the rebel seat of government, only to be repulsed by outnumbered enemy forces. Despite that humiliating record, Kidd predicted this campaign will squelch rebellion. The source of the Major's unflagging optimism was his total faith in his brigade commander, George Armstrong Custer. "We swear by him," Kidd declared. "His name is our battle cry. He can get twice the fight out of this brigade that any other man can possibly do." Less than 3 weeks later, the Army of the Potomac marched south, unleashing the bloodiest 2 months in America's deadliest war. Between May 4th and July 1st, Custer's brigade lost 776 officers and men, statistics which helped it claim an unenviable record at the war's end, the highest number of casualties sustained by any mounted organization of equivalent size in the Union Army. Yet through all the misery and slaughter, Kidd's admiration for Custer never wavered. From the midst of the mounting carnage, he informed his anxious loved ones, "For all that this brigade has accomplished, all praise is due to General Custer. So brave a man I never saw, and as competent as brave. Under him, a man is ashamed to be cowardly. Under him, our men can achieve wonders." Now, for all their sincere fervor, Kidd's words are bound to be rejected by most modern Americans. The only Custer they know is a loser, the man responsible for the United States Army's most famous defeat in an Indian war. Since the 1930s, it has been fashionable to picture Custer as a freak, a cold-blooded scoundrel, an egotistical misfit who attained high rank through dumb luck and then recklessly squandered the lives of friends and foes until he received his comeuppance at the Little Bighorn. The generation that weathered the Civil War, however, knew a different Custer. To those Americans, he was a genuine hero, dashing, brave, and able, a military prodigy whose exploits on horseback materially shortened a tragic fratricidal conflict. A society caught in the wrenching transition from agrarianism to industrialism embraced Custer as a personification of the comforting belief that war was still a glorious adventure, his deeds apparent proof that individual courage could decide great battles. Largely because of his brilliant Civil War career, the public heralded Custer as the nation's leading Indian fighter, even though his successes on the plains were not as numerous or decisive as those of other officers. And because ordinary citizens invested him with the aura of invincibility, his death at the Little Bighorn left a traumatic impression on their psyches, assuring the last stand an enduring place in America's popular consciousness. In the nearly 15 decades since the Custer fight, the event has assumed a life of its own, eclipsing nearly everything else about its main protagonist. Nevertheless, if Custer had not already been a national hero when he met his doom, his name would be no better known than those of other white commanders killed in Indian battles. Indeed, up to the present time, many paintings and films commemorating the last stand have depicted Custer as the Civil War's young general with the golden locks, rather than a short-haired, middle-aged lieutenant colonel who died 11 years after Appomattox. Disaster made Custer's name immortal, but the imagery of his final defeat is inextricably woven with the imagery of his earlier triumphs. His meteoric rise in the Civil War is as much a part of the Custer myth as his fall. Any effort to separate the man from the myth must begin with a conflict that shaped so much of his personal and professional character and determined the direction of his career. So let us start. When the War of the Rebellion erupted in April 1861, George Armstrong Custer was finishing his fourth turbulent year at the U.S. Military Academy. Long afterwards, he frankly admitted that his record as a cadet would never stand as an example to be emulated by those who followed in his footsteps. Custer's course at West Point may be described in the remark that he merely scraped through, a classmate observed. He was always loaded down with demerit marks. He was not attentive to his military duties, and he was anything but a good student. Underclassman Peter Mickey, who returned to West Point in 1871 to join the faculty, recalled, Custer was always in trouble with the authorities. He had more fun, gave his friends more anxiety, walked more tours of extra guard, and came nearer to being dismissed more often than any other cadet I had ever known. Cadet Custer's difficulties stemmed from an immature craving for thrills and attention, not lack of intelligence. He once told Mickey that there were only two positions in a class, head and foot. Since he was disinclined to strive for the former, he aimed for the latter. He studied just enough to keep from flunking out. He flouted regulations with reckless abandon until his tally of demerits neared the limit, requiring expulsion. Then he became the model of military decorum. To his delight, when graduation day rolled around on June 24, 1861, he ranked 34th in a class of 34. In the tradition of class clowns, Custer was extremely popular with his fellows. Everybody seemed to like the laughing cadet with the blonde curls and the devil-may-care attitude. Whenever mischief was brewing, Custer emerged as a natural leader. In an institution where hazing plebes was a hallowed custom, he excelled as an ingenious and indefatigable prankster, displaying an uncanny knack for instantly assessing a victim's weaknesses. Moreover, his horsemanship and athletic prowess impressed even his more serious-minded peers. The sudden onset of the secession crisis dampened even Custer's brilliance. As early as November 1860, he predicted the departure of the slave states would result in war. You cannot imagine how sorry I will be to see this happen, he wrote his sister, as the majority of my best friends and all my roommates except one have been from the South. As a Democrat, he sympathized with the white South's resolve to preserve a social order based on enslavement. But as an Ohioan, he felt bound by his cadet's oath to defend the Union. Incidentally, the chilling prospect of turning his sword against men he loved as brothers did not prevent him from seeking high rank in one of the volunteer regiments Ohio raised in response to the attack on Fort Sumter. I would prefer serving with the troops of my native state, he explained. Besides, I could get a much higher office, meaning rank, in the regular service, at least captain, and probably higher. Custer's dream of entering his profession at the top came to naught. He had to settle for a second lieutenant's commission in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, reporting to his company in time to witness the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861. That debacle convinced Union authorities their troops needed more training and better organization to crush the rebellion. Major General George B. McClellan, a dapper West Pointer credited with routing the secessionists from Western Virginia, was summoned to Washington, D.C. to mold a horde of recruits into a respectable field force. The subsequent formulation of McClellan's Army of the Potomac deprived Custer of much of the time he should have spent learning about cavalry operations on the company and battalion levels. In that assemblage of amateurs, even a poorly ingested West Point education was a prized commodity, and Custer rotated among the staffs of several minor generals, helping to process the paperwork necessary for the smooth running of military bureaucracies. In the spring of 1862, McClellan caught the Confederates off guard, slipping 100,000 soldiers onto the peninsula formed by the York and James Rivers in an amphibious flanking movement with Richmond as its objective. So he came down from Washington, D.C., and landed his troops at Fortress Monroe, and the idea was to advance up this peninsula and take the Confederate capital. Eager for some action, Custer took an army transport down Chesapeake Bay, only to be loaned to the topographical engineers as the campaign got underway. He soon tired of such tame pursuits as drawing maps and locating roads. Not even the chance to observe the enemy from a gas balloon quenched his thirst for excitement. Whenever he found a spare moment, he would ride off to any spot where combat seemed likely, prompting his colleagues to shout after him, "There goes Custer as usual, to smell out a fight." In an army where the ruling virtue was prudence bordering on timidity, Custer's belligerence stood out and earned him a series of commendations. On May 5th, 1862, he entered an engagement near Williamsburg, attaching himself to Brigadier General Winfield Scott Hancock as a volunteer aide. Dashing forward to inspire charging Federal infantry, he single-handedly captured 6 rebels and a large silk flag, reputedly the first colors taken by the Army of the Potomac. 20 days later, after a daring derelict reconnaissance to the south side of the Chickahominy River, he guided a raiding party back across it to overrun an enemy picket post. Lieutenant Custer was the first to cross the stream, reported Superior, the first to open fire, and one of the last to leave the field. When McClellan heard of the affair, he offered Custer a place on his staff with the temporary rank of captain. His muddy uniform still dripping the Chickahominy, the flabbergasted boy stammered his grateful acceptance. In 11 short months, Custer had progressed from class goat to membership in the official family of the Republic's most important soldier. A glittering new world of undreamed opportunities lay within his grasp. Appropriately enough, the new captain had been a McClellan admirer well before the general plucked him from obscurity. On the eve of his departure for the Peninsular Campaign, Custer testified, "I have more confidence in General McClellan than any man living. I would forsake everything and follow him to the ends of the earth. I would lay down my life for him. Every officer and private worships him. I would fight anyone who would say a word against him." Despite McClellan's penchant for self-delusion, his repeated failure to make proper use of his superior numbers, and his aversion to battle, Custer continued to regard him as, quote, "our only hope," end quote, in saving the Union. For his part, McClellan found Custer the ideal aide, brave, loyal, untiring, and efficient. His head was always clear in danger, the general reminisced, and he always brought me clear and intelligible reports. Indeed, had McClellan acted with greater speed on the intelligence Custer supplied during the Antietam campaign, he might have destroyed the major portion of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia before it could concentrate at Sharpsburg, Maryland. As it was, the poorly coordinated assaults Little Mac directed at Lee on September 17, 1862, produced nothing more tangible than the bloodiest day in American history. As McClellan permitted Lee's divisions, battered but intact, to withdraw into the safety of Virginia, President Abraham Lincoln's patience ran out. McClellan had been given a year to prove himself, and all he had to show for his elaborate efforts were setbacks, excuses, and recriminations. To make matters worse, The little general was an arrogant man unable to subordinate his conservative democratic principles to the decisions of his commander-in-chief. He dared to criticize the Lincoln administration's increasingly harsh war policies, particularly the Emancipation Proclamation. Obstructionism is a luxury that no unsuccessful general can afford. On November 7, 1862, McClellan learned of his dismissal as head of the Army of the Potomac, and he would hold no other command for the remainder of the war. For George Armstrong Custer, McClellan's ouster constituted a painful lesson in the principle of civilian control of the military. In company with other West Pointers, he rebelled against the notion that meddlesome politicians should have the authority to tell professional soldiers how to shape strategy and conduct operations. That resentment surfacing in both his immediate private correspondence and years later in his Civil War memoirs. In fact, there exists evidence to suggest Custer belonged to a group of hot-headed young staff officers who urged their beloved chief to march on Washington, seize power, and then deal with the Confederacy in his own terms. Fortunately, McClellan spurned temptation and bid his adoring troops farewell, leaving a deflated Custer with the reduced rank of first lieutenant in the 5th U.S. Cavalry. Following an extended winter leave in Monroe, Michigan, where he began, as most of you know, courting Elizabeth Bacon, whom he would marry on February 9, 1864, Custer received orders to join his company at Washington. But once again, a kindly superior saved him from the anonymous existence of a lowly subaltern. Sometime that spring, Brigadier General Alfred Pleasanton, the commander of a cavalry division, brought Custer under his staff. Attending Pleasanton could not compare with the prestige of riding in McClellan's entourage, but the appointment offered sufficient compensation. To begin with, Pleasanton was a rising star in the North's military firmament, and his staff was bound to share in his good fortune. 17 years of frontier service with the 2nd Dragoons had molded the short, slightly built martinet into one of the few Yankee generals who understood how to use the mounted arm. For the first 2 years of the Civil War, Federal cavalry units had done little to justify their existence, failing to match their rebel counterparts in reconnaissance, raiding, and combat. Confederate horsemen derived their edge from General Lee's policy of concentrating them in large strike forces, while their blue-clad foes were dispersed in impotent driblets as couriers and escorts for infantry generals. With prophetic wisdom, Pleasanton urged the establishment of a Union cavalry corps of several divisions, buttressing his recommendation with this promise: our cavalry can be made superior to any now in the field by organization. On February 5th, 1863, Major General Joseph Hooker, the new head of McClellan's old army, turned Pleasanton's dream into reality. But he presented the cavalry, he presented that coveted command, the Cavalry Corps, to Brigadier General George Stoneman, not to Pleasanton. A gifted schemer, Pleasanton strove to weasel his way into Hooker's good graces, disparaged Stoneman, and grabbed control of the Cavalry Corps. Unlike the obstreperous McClellan, Pleasanton courted the favor of President Lincoln and other Republican politicians. He was also a master at manipulating the news media, feeding correspondents skewed accounts that converted his modest successes into spectacular victories. Pleasanton's expertly orchestrated campaign of exaggeration, falsification, and string pulling paid quick dividends, gaining him Stoneman's job by May 22nd. When his prospering chief advanced in grade to Major General a month later, Custer could anticipate a corresponding promotion to captain. Pleasanton proved an outstanding administrator, but he possessed a serious flaw as a soldier. That was an aversion to risking his life in battle. Lieutenant Custer, on the other hand, relished danger, a trait that attracted his general's notice. Pleasanton quickly came to rely on the blonde daredevil to carry instructions to embattled elements of the Cavalry Corps, often empowering Custer to use his personal judgment and issue his own orders to senior officers. Thanks to this growing dependence, the Pleasanton-Custer relationship soon shed the strict formality of master and servant and evolved into something much warmer. The general called the younger man boy and took an active interest in his personal life. I do not believe a father could love his son, Custer insisted, more than General Pleasanton loves me. Pleasanton's growing trust and the commencement of the Gettysburg campaign furnished Custer with ample opportunities to display his talent for combat leadership, and his exploits were enhanced by the Union cavalry's newborn willingness to close with the enemy. At Brandy Station on June 9, 1863, Custer rode in the spearhead of one of Pleasanton's columns, distinguished himself in a surprise attack that foreshadowed the demise of Confederate mounted supremacy in the Eastern Theater. 8 days later, in a sharp skirmish at Aldie, Custer helped rally the 1st Maine Cavalry as it recoiled before a rebel thrust and then led the regiment in a countercharge. When his skittish horse carried him in the midst of the enemy, Custer kept his head and cut his way clear with the saber, downing 3 assailants in the process, a feat that won him mention in northern newspapers. Thus far, Custer's association with Pleasanton had brought him increased responsibilities, several commendations, and the mixed pleasure of seeing his name misspelled in the New York Times, which was not the only paper that would call him Custer during that conflict. But none of that truly satisfied him. Many of his West Point friends were now leading regiments and brigades, while Custer remained nothing more than a glorified messenger boy. Bent on securing a command of his own, he focused his attention on the recently raised 5th Michigan Cavalry, 5th Michigan Cavalry Regiment, whose colonel had been upgraded to brigadier general. Claiming Michigan citizenship on the basis of a few years' residence with a half-sister in Monroe, he presented himself as a candidate for the vacant colonelcy, to the state's Republican governor, Austin Blair. So he asked Blair to make him colonel of the 5th Michigan Cavalry. Heeding Pleasanton's example, Custer prevailed on a prominent Republican politician from Monroe to plead his suit with Blair. At the same time, he rounded up endorsements from 7 influential generals, leaking their high opinions of his merits to the Michigan press. Finally, he visited the 5th Michigan in camp in northern Virginia and asked its officers to petition Blair in his favor. Put off by Custer's youth and impertinence, the officers declined to lend their names to his cause. Even if Custer had filled his petition with signatures, his chances of impressing Blair would have remained slim. Crass political patronage determined the awarding of commissions in Union volunteer regiments. In Blair's eyes, Custer's liabilities far outweighed his military credentials. The boy was a Democrat, and his family came from the wrong side of the tracks. Infinitely worse, Custer was a McClellan man, a crippling handicap since McClellan's continuing criticism of the Lincoln administration made him the likely Democratic nominee for the 1864 presidential race. Refusing to deviate from the spoils system, Blair installed a solid Republican lawyer and businessman as the 5th colonel on June 11, 1863. Whatever disappointment Custer felt dissolved before the month's end. On June 28, within hours of succeeding Hooker as the head of the Army of the Potomac, Major General George G. Meade appointed 3 captains in the Cavalry Corps as brigadier generals in the U.S. Volunteers. Their names were Wesley Merritt, Allen J. Farnsworth, and George A. Custer. It was no coincidence that the lucky trio were also alumni of Pleasanton's staff. Meade's cavalry chief had pushed hard for their elevation. Ever protective of his own reputation, Pleasanton hoped to revitalize his command by filling the top slots with, quote, officers with the proper dash to command cavalry, end quote, meaning young men who are not afraid to fight. Give me 15,000 cavalry, Pleasanton begged. Let me place my own officers over it, and I will soon place Lee where he now has us, on the defensive. Having built his career on intrigue, Pleasanton also wanted to surround himself with senior subordinates who owed their advancement and hence their loyalty to him. An inveterate xenophobe, he cleared the way for his protégés by deposing several foreign-born division and brigade leaders. In addition, Pleasanton strengthened his political position by so favoring two of his ex-aides. Allen Farnsworth's uncle was Congressman John Farnsworth, an Illinois Republican, a personal friend of the president, and Pleasanton's main intermediary at the White House. Wesley Merritt's father edited a Democratic newspaper in southern Illinois, making him a useful connection should the war-weary northern electorate turn against the Republicans. As far as Custer was concerned, Pleasanton did not harbor similar ulterior motives. When someone later questioned the wisdom of presenting such an exalted rank to a stripling just 2 years out of West Point, his patron snapped, "Custer is the best cavalry general in the world." Now, however debatable this claim might be, Pleasanton sincerely believed what he said. He had no other reason to insist on his favorite aide's promotion. As Custer's future father-in-law, who at the time was no admirer of his daughter's suitor, realized, and I quote, "No man could be made a general at 23 without political influence unless there was something in him as a man and a soldier." Now, when Custer traded his lieutenant's shoulder straps for a brigadier's star, he received command of the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Cavalry Division, known simply as the Michigan Brigade, because it was the only such unit in the Cavalry Corps to draw all its regiments, and those regiments were the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, from the same state. Appealing to local pride to build morale, Custer dubbed the outfit the Wolverine Brigade and vowed, "I would not exchange it for any brigade in the Army." Perhaps nothing about his appointment pleased him more than its irony. "The regiment of which I attempted to obtain the colonelcy," he's referring to the 5th Michigan Cavalry, "belongs to my brigade," he explained, "so that I rather outwitted the governor who did not see fit to give it to me." But even as Custer gloated, he noted certain deficiencies in his regiments. "When I assumed command," he mused afterward, "few, if any of the men," and the only exception would be the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment, which was organized in 1861, he said, "few, if any of the men had even heard a hostile shot fired. Their discipline was lax and organization incomplete. As soon as a lull occurred in the summer campaigning, Custer meant to instruct and train his officers and men until they all stood in what he called unequaled in every trait essential to soldiers." But with Lee's second invasion of the North in full swing, the Michiganders would receive their first lesson about soldiering in the merciless school of combat. In less than a week, with Custer at the reins, the Wolverine Brigade justified its fearsome nickname. On the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, as the greatest battle waged on American soil neared its climax, 6,000 Confederate cavalry under Major General Jeb Stuart squared off against 5,000 blue troopers on rolling farmland 3 miles east of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Stuart hoped to skirt the Army of the Potomac's right flank and create confusion in its rear, while Major General George E. Pickett, with a division of Virginians and 2 other Confederate divisions, about 13,000 men in all, pierced the Federal center on Cemetery Ridge. As the senior Union officer present, Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg took charge of the force opposing Stuart, but he confined the 2 brigades from his 2nd Cavalry Division to supporting roles. Custer's 2,344 Michiganders would bear the brunt of the coming duel with the cream of Lee's cavalry. For more than 2 hours, Stuart probed Gregg's deployments with artillery fire and clouds of skirmishers. Then at 4 p.m., 2 rebel brigades lumbered forward to sweep the Yankees from the field. With half his brigade disrupted by the previous fighting, Custer had only 1 regiment, the veteran 1st Michigan, in position to meet the approaching masses. 500 Yankee troopers to stop more than 4 times their number. Unwilling to let his men enter an unequal contest without him, Custer placed himself at their head. As the puny band moved out, an officer, Union officer, was heard to moan, "Great heavens, we shall all be swallowed up." Laying spurs to his steed, Custer shot forward until the entire regiment could see him. And then, just before he disappeared among the rebels, he brandished his saber and shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Cheering like maniacs, the Michiganders bounded after their intrepid brigadier, slashing, stabbing, and shooting at anyone in gray. Staggered by the Federals' ferocious impetuosity and by flank attacks, driven home by some squadrons from Gregg's division and regrouped companies of the 5th and 7th Michigan, the Confederate column melted away in retreat. The Michigan Brigade was properly ecstatic. The cavalry battle east of Gettysburg had been the unit's first major engagement, and the Wolverines had outfought the legendary Jeb Stuart and his vaunted Invincibles, an exploit that gave the lie to the myth of Southern cavalry superiority. Moreover, any doubts the Michiganders harbored about their new brigadier general disappeared in the face of his courageous personal style of leadership. One excited trooper penned this tribute to General Custer on July 9, 1863. "He is a glorious fellow, full of energy, quick to plan and bold to execute, and with us he has never failed in any attempt he has yet made." Custer attracted additional praise in the 11 days following Gettysburg as the Union cavalry harassed Lee's withdrawal to Virginia. At Falling Waters, Maryland, on the last day of the pursuit, the Michigan Brigade swamped the rebel rear guard, nabbing 1,500 prisoners and 3 battle flags. Amid the final flurry of hand-to-hand combat, a 5th Michigan private saw, and I quote, "General Custer plunge his saber into the belly of a rebel who was trying to kill him. You can guess how bravely soldiers fight for such a general." Gallant officers make good soldiers. That became Custer's motto, and he loved to practice what he preached. When Custer made a charge, he was the first saber that struck, confirmed the troop commander, for he was always ahead. Civil War soldiers expected their officers to behave fearlessly under fire. Such displays reassured the men. But Custer exceeded the strict standards of his age. Whenever he orders a charge, he always leads in person, enthused the New York Herald. Watching Custer direct a skirmish, an aide marveled, "Through all that sharp and heavy firing, the general gave his orders as though conducting a parade or review, so cool and indifferent that he inspired us all with something of his coolness and courage." To ensure his example did not go unnoticed, Custer designed a special uniform for himself. Known as his fighting trim, it consisted of a tight hussar jacket and trousers of black velveteen garnished with yards of gold lace, a blue sailor shirt bearing a white star on each side of the collar, a long cravat of flaming scarlet, a black broad-brimmed hat adorned with a gold cord and a silver star, and a pair of high-top boots sporting gilt spurs. With his blonde mustache, imperial, and shoulder-length hair, he looked like the reincarnation of some 17th century cavalier. The admiring Northern press christened him the boy general with the golden locks, and his troopers cheered him as Old Curly. Soon every Wolverine was wearing a red necktie, and many officers ordered smart blue jackets festooned with gold. and like their general, the Wolverines became noted for a courage as conspicuous as their appearance. During the fall of 1863, Union and Confederate cavalry clashed with jarring frequency as Meade and Lee sparred inconclusively in northern Virginia. With each passing engagement, Custer matured as a general. As his confidence grew, he displayed more initiative and won increasing respect from his superiors and subordinates. More than once, his bold assaults extricated the 3rd Cavalry Division from traps sprung by the crafty Jeff Stewart. Succumbing to a euphoria born of repeated success, Custer blurted to a friend, "Oh, could you but have seen some of the charges that were made? While thinking of them, I cannot but exclaim, glorious war." In his boyish naivete, Custer trusted that battlefield exploits alone would please his civilian masters enough to keep them from laying him, as he put it, on the shelf. But in an institution as politicized as the Union Army, any general craving job security had to keep one eye on the Confederates and the other on Washington. Early in 1864, Custer learned that unnamed enemies were at work in the U.S. Senate to block confirmation of his appointment as Brigadier General. Unable to fault his military record, they charged him with being a McClellan man, and even a copperhead, a closet traitor, out to sabotage administration war policies. Desperate to clear his name and save his commission, Custer sent an open letter, 8 pages in length, to Jacob M. Howard, a powerful Michigan Republican who sat on the Senate's Military Affairs Committee. To be sure, Custer's private utterances about the war, at least earlier in the war, reflected the convictions of a McClellan Democrat. "I never heard slavery mentioned as an issue," he informed his father-in-law. "The Union. It was the Union we were fighting for." But now, with so much at stake, he showered Senator Howard with sentiments worthy of a radical Republican. And I quote, "The President, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and as my superior officer, cannot issue any decree or order which will not receive my unqualified support. But I do not stop here. All his acts, proclamations, and decisions embraced in his war policy have received not only my support, but my most hearty, earnest, and cordial approval." Touching on Lincoln's controversial Emancipation Proclamation, he asserted, "My friends can testify that I have insisted that so long as a single slave was held in bondage, I, for one, was opposed to peace on any terms. And to show that my acts agree with my words, I can boast of having liberated more slaves from their masters than any other general in this army. As for the possibility of ending the war through negotiation rather than conquest," Custer protested, "I would offer no compromise except that which is offered at the point of the bayonet." This flawlessly, well, you can call it disingenuous or careerist performance, made Custer the darling of the Republican majority in Congress, and his confirmation sped through the Senate. In fact, such highly placed radicals as Ohio Senator Ben Wade spoke of raising him to Major General as soon as a vacancy occurs. Those were Wade's words. While the Civil War lasted, Custer took special pains to retain the goodwill of his Republican patrons. Later in 1864, after a superior warned him to expect the conferral of a division command, the boy general diffused possible political opposition by writing a strong pro-Lincoln letter that just happened to find its way into the press. The fact that this letter appeared a few weeks prior to the presidential election endeared Custer all the more to the ruling party. But the young cavalryman was possibly too consummate a careerist to bet all his money on one horse. Even as Custer backed Lincoln in public, one of his former aides escorted a McClellan campaign official on an expedition to canvass soldier votes at the front. There's no direct evidence that Custer arranged this, but this is coincidental evidence that can't be ignored. Ingratiating himself with Congress did not render the boy general immune to all the strains of army politics, an unpleasant truth that became evident in the wake of his confirmation victory. Desiring to personally supervise the annihilation of Lee's ragged but resilient army of Northern Virginia, Lee's Confederate Army, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, the conqueror of Vicksburg and newly appointed General-in-Chief of the armies of the United States, attached his headquarters to the Army of the Potomac in March 1864. Grant liked to surround himself with produce, and he rearranged the upper echelons of the Cavalry Corps to provide places for two pets from the Western Theater. Custer's closest associates fell victim to Grant's manipulations. Pleasanton was banished to the Department of Missouri, one of the war's backwater sectors. Brigadier General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, Custer's division commander, was posted to the Army of the Cumberland for the Atlanta campaign under Sherman. Pleasanton's transfer deprived Custer of a valued friend and protector, and he brooded over the ungrateful treatment accorded a general who never lost a battle and who was the first to give a character and reputation to the cavalry. Kilpatrick's fate, on the other hand, elicited no such misgivings. A shameless braggart and grandstander, Kilpatrick was known as Kill Cavalry because of his reckless tactics and utter disregard for the lives of those serving under him, defects which had cost him Custer's respect the previous autumn. As Kilpatrick's senior subordinate, Custer felt entitled to inherit the command of Kilpatrick's 3rd Cavalry Division, a sentiment shared by General Meade. But the prize went to a bright young engineer from Grant's staff, Brigadier General James H. Wilson. Conveniently forgetting the role that string pulling played in his own rise, Custer denounced Wilson as this court favorite, an imbecile and upstart who has never even commanded a company of men, and since assuming command of the division has made himself ridiculous by the ignorance he displays in respect to cavalry. Furthermore, Wilson was Custer's junior in rank by 4 months. To avoid undue friction and other complications, the Michigan Brigade and its fuming boy general were shifted from the 3rd Cavalry Division to the 1st. Though unable to disguise his contempt for Wilson, Custer developed an instant liking for Pleasanton's successor, Major General Philip H. Sheridan. No pampered paper shuffler, Little Phil was a hot-blooded fighting general, renowned for his valor at Perryville, Stones River, and Missionary Ridge. The charismatic Irishman also harbored some ambitious plans for his corps. He wanted to employ his troopers as an independent combat arm rather than as mere auxiliaries for Meade's infantry. On May 9, 1864, less than a month after Grant opened his spring offensive, Sheridan cut loose from the Army of the Potomac with 10,000 blue horsemen, skirted Lee's left flank, and headed straight for Richmond. So he, excuse me, cut away from the Union Army and went on an arc to try to get to Richmond, Virginia, if you'll excuse me. He calculated, Sheridan did, that a lunge at the rebel capital would draw the Confederate cavalry into the open for a showdown. Snapping at the bait on May 11th, Jeb Stuart threw 4,500 Gray Riders across Sheridan's path at a crossroads called Yellow Tavern. As the 3 Yankee divisions deployed for battle, Custer spotted a vulnerable point in Stuart's line. Taking his own brigade and part of another, Custer overran an enemy artillery battery in a brilliantly conducted charge. When Stuart galloped up to seal the breach, a dismounted Wolverine shot him in the abdomen with a pistol, inflicting a mortal wound. Having humbled and weakened his southern foe, Sheridan turned homeward, But General Wilson, who held the van, he was leading the Cavalry Corps back, lost his way and blundered into the Richmond defenses. To Custer's glee, Sheridan sent him to extricate the bumbling engineer and create an escape route for the Cavalry Corps. The boy general executed his order with skill and speed, and Sheridan expressed his satisfaction in no uncertain terms, saying, "Custer is the ablest man in the Cavalry Corps." Now, as superiors went, Sheridan proved a harsh master, a general who demanded results and tolerated no excuses. Even so, he was quite generous to subordinates who met his expectations, and since he had Grant's ear, he could be a powerful patron. The Richmond raid showed Sheridan that Custer was one of his, and again I quote Sheridan, most gallant and efficient officers, but such regard carried a high price. Sheridan depended on Custer as his main troubleshooter, utilizing him and his crack Michigan brigade to contain emergencies and carry out dangerous duties. Custer neatly summarized service under Sheridan when he wrote, "We have passed through days of carnage and have lost heavily. The Michigan brigade has covered itself with undying glory." Upset by newspaper accounts of her husband's recurring brushes with death, Custer's new bride complained, "Why is it your brigade has to do everything?" Price paid by elite units. In August 1864, Grant dispatched Sheridan to the Shenandoah Valley, this area here, northwest from Washington, D.C. So he sent Sheridan to the Shenandoah Valley to dispose of Lieutenant General Jubal A. Early's impudent Confederate army, which had recently menaced Washington. Incorporated into Sheridan's 40,000-man Army of the Shenandoah were the 1st and 3rd Cavalry Divisions. With its open fields and rolling hills, the valley was ideal cavalry country, and here Custer attained his apex as a soldier. At the climactic moment in the Battle of Winchester, September 19, 1864, Custer rallied 600, or 500 I should say, of his Wolverines and rode down an entrenched brigade of 1,600 rebel infantry, taking 700 prisoners as he turned Early's left flank and threw the rebels into a panic. In a war where the increased range of infantry weapons threatened the saber charge with obsolescence, Custer's achievement merited a substantial reward. On September 30th, after the hapless Wilson departed for the Western Theater to salvage his reputation, Sheridan presented Custer with the 3rd Cavalry Division. The 3rd Division had deteriorated badly during Wilson's tenure. Wilson was universally considered to be an unlucky man, acknowledged an Ohio sergeant. "We never had confidence in him or ourselves." Welcoming the challenge, Custer wasted no time in restoring the division's morale and effectiveness. On October 9th, he routed a larger rebel cavalry division led by his old friend from West Point days, Brigadier General Thomas L. Rosser, capturing all the enemy's guns and wheeled transport. "With Custer as a leader," crowed an elated Yankee captain, "we are all heroes and hankering for a fight." Speaking for the rank and file, Wilson's Ohio critic added, "Each member felt proud to be known as one of Custer's division. With Custer, we never began, but we felt sure of victory." 10 days later, in Sheridan's decisive victory at Cedar Creek, Custer plunged through a gap in Early's left wing just as the Confederate line started to crumple. Pursuing the stampeding foe, Custer's cheering troopers picked up 45 cannon and swarms of prisoners. Sheridan signified his pleasure by brevetting the young daredevil to Major General. Custer returned the favor on March 2, 1865, when he smashed the remains of Early's army at Waynesboro. Eager to return to the control of their beloved boy general, hundreds of officers and men from the Michigan Brigade petitioned for transfer to the 3rd Cavalry Division, but to no avail. Meeting one of Custer's sergeants, a Wolverine voiced his frustration. "Why, since Custer left the 1st Division, it has done nothing. Now all you hear about is the 3rd Division. The 3rd Division captured so many battle flags. Nothing but the 3rd Division, while the 1st Division is scarcely heard of. The fact is, you have Custer now. With the Shenandoah Valley pacified, Sheridan rode east to assist Grant in prying Lee out of the earthworks guarding Richmond and Petersburg. Marshaling a mixed force of cavalry and infantry, Little Phil chopped up the right wing of the Army of Northern Virginia at Five Forks on April 1st, 1865, severing the last 2 railroads feeding supplies to the besieged Confederates. To save his troops from starvation and encirclement, Lee abandoned Richmond and darted west to elude Grant. Urged on by the relentless Sheridan, 4 Union cavalry divisions galloped in pursuit, lashing the weary rebels every step of the way. Intoxicated with the spirit of the chase, Custer outdid his colleagues in carving away chunks of Lee's shrinking army. By April 6th, the 4th day of the epic race, the bronze bluecoats comprising the boy general's escort detail bore 31 rebel battle flags, each tattered banner a mute symbol of a destroyed Confederate regiment. As dusk fell on April 8th, Custer headed off his desperate quarry at Appomattox Station, the jubilant Federal troopers seizing 4 trains crammed with munitions and supplies meant for the exhausted rebel fugitives. Leading the retreat, Lee's reserve artillery, 30 guns, attempted to blast the 3rd Cavalry Division out of the depot. Amid the intermittent glare of shells bursting in the fading light, Custer regrouped his scattered squadrons and led a series of small assaults. We expected Custer would be killed every time, reported an enlisted man in the 2nd Ohio Cavalry, but he was not scratched, though he had a horse or 2 killed under him. He really appeared to lead a charmed life. Before darkness forced an end to the fighting, Custer had 24 field pieces in his possession. Bringing up his other 3 horse divisions, Sheridan held Lee in place until the next morning, when the arrival of 3 corps Federal infantry, including one of African-American troops, robbed the rebels of their last hope of escape. Custer received the enemy's first flag of truce, and a few hours later, Lee surrendered in the parlor of the Wilmer McLean House. After the great Virginian left to confront his heartbroken followers, Sheridan purchased the table on which the articles of capitulation had been drafted. Little Phil sent the precious trophy to Elizabeth Custer, along with the following note: I respectfully present to you the small writing table on which the conditions for the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia were written by Lieutenant General Grant. And permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring about this desirable result than your gallant husband. No soldier could desire a finer tribute. Whatever errors Custer later committed as an Indian fighter, he shone in the controversial set-piece battles that decided the Civil War in the Eastern Theater. As a cavalryman, he rated second only to Sheridan. Custer possessed an eye for picking out an opposing formation's weaknesses and the ruthless nerve it took to exploit what he saw. He knew when to charge on horseback and when to defend on foot. Surrounded by soldiers who did not shy from hardship or danger, he proved an inspiring and considerate commander. He brought out the best in his troopers with his fearless example, firm but humane discipline, compassionate treatment for his sick and wounded, and the promise of medals, furloughs, or promotions in recognition of valorous conduct. A lot of his officers and men ended up with the Medal of Honor, and that was his doing. Most important of all, his tactical decisions usually resulted in victory at a reasonable cost. Custer was a man extremely careful to give his soldiers every advantage of position that could be obtained, wrote Quartermaster Sergeant Roger Hannaford of the 2nd Ohio Cavalry. But when that was done, he struck hard and swift. He was by no means the reckless harum-scarum so many represent him to be. Judging from the numerous accolades found in the memoirs, letters, and diaries left by his followers. What I quoted here today just skims the surface. Custer was one of the most popular generals in the Army of the Potomac. Even infantrymen, who habitually jeered the cavalry, could not suppress their hurrahs when Old Curly cantered by. To the continuing bewilderment of his biographers, the Custer recalled by Civil War veterans bears little resemblance to the petty, impulsive tyrant described by so many 7th Cavalrymen who knew him later in the West. The Civil War, the grandest strategy in America's annals, was the most fulfilling period in Custer's life. Blessed with a combination of personal charisma, physical stamina, martial talent, and political savvy, he climbed to the summit of his profession before his 25th birthday. Both on the battlefield and behind the lines, he made the right moves and pleased the right people. He would spend the 11 remaining years of his life in a futile quest to match the deeds that earned him acclaim that earned him so much acclaim, I should say, in 1863, 1864, and 1865. Perhaps if he had not succeeded so well as the boy general, George Armstrong Custer might have died a less driven and a less controversial man. Thank you. So I'm at your mercy now for questions.
You kind of dropped an Easter egg in your discussion of Antietam, something about intelligence information that Custer gave to McClellan that he ignored. Could you elaborate on that?
Stephen Sears, who wrote what remains the leading biography of George B. McClellan, in covering the Antietam campaign, he cites a couple of dispatches from Custer that told McClellan the road was open here, the road was open there, and McClellan hesitated to plunge through. So he probably, he could have nipped a bit more of Lee's army before it concentrated, and if he had nipped enough of it, he could have destroyed it. So.
There's always this tale in Monroe that Custer had 11 horses shot off him under him. Does that carry any weight?
That's a standard number, yeah.
That would be 3 of them in one day? Was that the number that I heard also?
I can't speak to that, but I know he lost at least 2 in a single engagement. I wouldn't be surprised if he lost that many in a fight. He lost a number of horses because he was out front, and horses are big, bigger targets than men.
They said he only had one wound. It was a wound, and it was through his boot.
At Culpeper Courthouse, when he was charging a section of Jeb Stuart's artillery with the 1st Vermont Cavalry, which had been temporarily assigned to the Michigan Brigade during the fall of 1863, as he got close to the Confederate guns, one fired and sent a shell that went through his horse and nicked one leg. It wasn't a serious wound. After the engagement, he rode back to Pleasanton to report, and George Gordon Meade's, one of his aides-de-camps, Theodore Lyman, was there, and he said Custer came riding up, looking nonchalant, and he stuck his leg out, which had blood streaming from it. He said, they ruined my boots, but no loss there. I captured them from a Reb, and he got the furlough, which enabled him to return to Monroe that fall and cinch things for the wedding. Yeah. I mean, a lot of amazing things happened during the Civil War, but Custer had more than his share of amazing brushes. And if he had been an infantry officer, he probably wouldn't have lasted as long as he did. I mean, as a cavalry commander, you could move around, and when you're fighting enemies who are on horseback and they're trying to shoot at you from the back of a bounding steed, their aim isn't all that good. But another fight in the Shenandoah Valley, a bullet skimmed his temple and took a couple locks off. A reporter, it was either the New York Times or the New York Tribune, saw him slap his hand up to his side of his head, and it was a close call, not a wound. So yeah. But going into the Civil War, there's a book by Gerald Linderman called Embattled Courage, and the young men who entered the Civil War had a different conception of courage. I did two books about World War II. I got to interview American troops, Marines mainly, who defended Wake Island in December 1941. And a couple of them, talking about things they did in combat, said, I was still scared as hell, even if they were doing their job. He said, if anyone, and a couple of times I heard what's become cliche, if anybody who was there tells you they weren't scared, they weren't there. Going into the Civil War, it was considered unmanly to admit you were afraid. It was considered unmanly to dodge or take cover when you were being fired at. Now, Civil War soldiers learned better, but Custer embodied that creed, and his troopers responded to it. Part of it was because they wanted the thing over as quickly as possible, and this guy was fighting and leading them to victory. So they were willing to go with him, even though they suffered a pretty heavy casualty rate. So it's part of the madness of it all. Yes?
Yeah, you made a passing reference that after the Civil War, the last 11 years of his life, he got a reputation for being petty, somewhat of a martinet. A lot of his support team.
If you read,
any idea what happened to his personality after the Civil War was over?
This guy hits the summit at 25. How many rock stars put out a best-selling album at that age, and then the rest of their lives they're trying to measure up to that success? That's part of it. That's part of it. But he goes from one army to a different army. The Civil War, most of the Union troops are volunteers who want to save the Union and get home. And they'll go through hell to do it. In the Indian Fighting Army, for a lot of the men who joined the Army, it was a job. And they just wanted to get through each day without being pushed too hard. And they resented officers who pushed them hard. Also, a lot of officers, the Army was shrunk in size. It goes from 1,100,000 at the end of May, 1865. Most of these guys are short-term volunteers. When the war's over, they go home. The Army shrinks. Most of the officers who are left in service go down in rank. I mean, Custer's general stars, that he wore those as being a general of U.S. volunteers. That was a temporary army. In the regular army, he rises in rank. He starts the war as a second lieutenant, but he ends it as a captain. And he reverts to that rank when the army the volunteer army is disbanded. But then Congress decides we're going to need a bigger regular army than we had in 1860 because on the plains in the Rocky Mountains, volunteer troops like the fellows who massacred Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek and went after the Navajo under Kit Carson, seeking a final solution. They've torn the lid off that part of the West. I mean, there's greater violence now than ever before. So we need troops to try and pacify those indigenous peoples. We have to keep an eye on Canada because Britain really isn't friendly, and the French have invaded Mexico, violating the Monroe Doctrine. So we have to station troops in the Rio Grande to pressure them out, to get rid of Emperor Maximilian, and see that Juarez becomes, is seated in Mexico City as the president of Mexico. So they say we'll have 56,000 men, and they form 4 new cavalry regiments, and Custer gets second in command of one of the 4 new cavalry regiments, the 7th Cavalry. But he doesn't rise any higher than that for the next 10 years of his life, and that's not untypical in that army. I mean, they're guys, captains in their 50s before if they're still alive and active, they get up into field rank, and not all of them did. So a lot of officers develop the attitude, why should I kill myself? I'm not going to get rewarded. Here I am exiled out here, trying to enforce this policy against these people with whom many of them sympathized. But, you know, the government says, go punish this group of Indians, go punish that group of Indians. That's what they're doing. But even if they do it, you know, they're being criticized by a lot of folks in the East, including former abolitionists who think what's being done to the Native peoples is terrible. They're cheered by people in the West, but it doesn't affect their rate of promotion. They're still stuck somewhere where you're lucky to see a newspaper that's 6 months old, you know, and it's depressing. Now, Custer, during the Civil War, he's able to inspire his Civil War volunteers by what he does on the battlefield. Okay, this guy's going to get us to victory quicker. That doesn't work out in the West. There are not as many opportunities to do that. His first Indian victory is controversial because a number of his men are left behind, and he's blamed for their deaths. And the Eastern press says that Black Kettle was a peace chief, and so his village should not have been attacked. And Custer reverts to the form of discipline that he learned at West Point, where you punish people into doing the right thing. You know, West Pointers, if they committed any infractions, they got slapped with demerits. In the regular army, you place people under arrest. And a lot of these, especially officers who had fought through the Civil War, didn't like being treated that way. So, you know, if you read the letters and diaries and memoirs of people who served under Custer in the West, about half of them didn't like him. Half did. I mean, it's just, that's what the sources tell us. So, the 7th Cavalry is not the only regiment to have these personality problems, but it did have these personality problems, and there's some who believe that these problems had a big bearing because the two senior officers on whom Custer relied, the Little Bighorn, Benteen and Reno, are accused of letting him down. And of course, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But it's a very long answer. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes?
So I took a lot of notes. I took a lot of notes during your, talk. And I hear a lot about this was Custer's golden age.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is what Custer
It's
is
the best
well
period of
known
his
for.
life.
But I took some notes, and what I was hearing was he was belligerent, he was enthusiastic about fighting.
He was aggressive, yeah.
Yeah, he sympathized with the Southerners, the slave owners, but he chose to fight in the war because he was in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And he also said, I believe he said, he started speaking out against slavery and stuff when it would kind of give him political gain.
That was the timing, yeah.
So,
But he is freeing slaves before that.
and then he also had a father-son relationship with Pleasanton, who was undermining and scheming, manipulating the news.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this is, in my opinion, very negative, even not taking into account the native fighting, that happened later that he did get a worse reputation from.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm hearing, I hear he was, the people were hot-headed, but he was cool and indifferent on the battlefield, and to me that those are signs of someone who isn't, he's reckless with his men's lives, is what people said.
No,
But-
they don't say
but-
that. They say he wasn't reckless during the Civil War.
So it sounds like his Civil War efforts were for personal gain, at least in the beginning, but that's also what he's been using. So I guess Monroe obviously idolizes Custer. We have a statue, we have roads, we have streets, we have a whole museum. We're having 2 years of lectures on him. What is that? To me, it looks like a fetish for violence and reenactments of war, more than it is about Custer's.
About Custer, we wouldn't be here.
If he didn't live in Ohio, I feel like Custer would fight on the opposite side.
It's
So-
possible.
I
It's possible.
personally, what do you
But
think?
Rodney Lee had come from
What
New
do you
York. He
think-
would have been a Union officer.
Why do you think we idolize him here?
Well, I don't live here, but he was important. He played a leading role in winning the Civil War, saving the Union, and also destroying slavery. Like a lot of Northern men who went into the war, including Abraham Lincoln, he did not go into it initially to end slavery. But a lot of people, when they are exposed to the horrors of slavery, and they get to meet black people and they get to know them as people, And when they experience the fact that these are the Southerners we can trust, their attitude changes. And so they will support the 13th Amendment. And they will support the passage and ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Freedom. Like, he fought in the Civil War, you know, possibly for potential personal gain because of where he lived. And then after he won,
Well,
he worked against the freedom, the right, equal rights for black people. He was part of that campaign.
When Johnson invited him to go on the swing around the circle, he, Ulysses S. Grant, Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, a number of people did that. Yeah. Yeah, he was conservative. That's the term that would have been used at that time. But that's part of the paradox. He's not willing to go perhaps as far as black political equality, but he is willing to end slavery. And he's one of the few Union generals who in effect treated a black employee, Eliza Brown, who freed herself and then attached herself to him as his cook, as a member of his family. There are very few Union generals who you will find posing in photographs with people of color. There are very few Indian Wars commanders who you will find posing with their Indian scouts. He fought against Indians, but he fought for Indians. He fought for the people who were driven from their homelands by the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne who came out of Minnesota in the late 18th century. You know, that was their traditional homeland. And there were Indians who fought with him. He had Indian allies. So it's complicated. He's a human being. You can find flaws. You can interpret that the way that you're interpreting it. But at the same time, the man demonstrated terrific heroism. And the people who erected that monument were his veterans, the Michigan Cavalry Association, the people who followed him during the Civil War, who wanted, in effect, to memorialize their own achievements. And Custer was a recognizable symbol of their unit, just as the Third Army, trying to memorialize its deeds during World War II, would put up a statue of Patton. So, I mean, you may find that hard to fathom, but that's the best answer I can give you. There's some people who see more good in him than bad, and there are others who feel differently, just as during his lifetime.
It just sounds like he was good at killing, and
he was good at killing. Yeah, he was good at killing, but he was also good at leading troops and maneuvering troops and winning battles. It wasn't just he went out; he just didn't go out and shoot people. It was in combat. So there are a lot of people who received the Medal of Honor because they killed a lot of the enemy, but they were doing it for their country. So I think that's the way a lot of people view him as an outstanding United States soldier. Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. You shouldn't think that kind of thing. That's the way I view it, and I really can't speak for the people of this community. I'll let them do that themselves. Yes.
Hello, Professor Urwin. I will admit I haven't read any of your books, but I have listened
Well,
to several.
you and millions of others. I would like to cure that, but I haven't found a way.
But I definitely will read some of your books now, and I have listened to several of your lectures before now in order to get myself more familiar with the work. I want to say that I appreciate your work in historical objectivity. I also appreciate your work in addressing the impacts of race and racism in military history and American history. I'm definitely going to read your book, Flag Over Dixie.
Yeah, that earned me the status of heritage violator from the Sons of Confederate Veterans.
Oh, really?
Which of all the honors I've received, I'm probably proudest of.
And I'm also listened to part of your lecture on Freedom War Redcoat about Cornwallis.
That's my current.
About giving freedom to enslaved people during the Revolutionary War. So I appreciate your comments about that. I do want to address that I'm one of the many people in Monroe too who want to address more of the historical nuances of history and the impacts of racism. And I appreciate your comments too about addressing what you call feel-good history that some people have about the Revolution. I also want to address some similar issues that I have.
Spirited discussion is a good thing.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, we should hear each other
Yeah.
as well as speak to each
Yes, I
other.
agree
I
with you.
appreciate, again, your remarks.
Yes, and see, I appreciate your comments too about the nuances of, see, Custer's life and his character, but also about the conflicts with Native Americans, and again, the conflicts between Lakota, Cheyenne, as well as Crow and Arikara. What I want to ask of you is, what would you recommend the people, the city, and the institutions of Monroe to do in order to flesh out Custer's character and his legacy, and impact on other people that we still deal with today?
Become historians, but a lot of people that I know in the town do read widely, and read books that you know question your point of view. Because if you only read or listen to people who think the way you do, you never learn anything new. And again, you know, history should be grounded in sources. We have values, we have passions, we have a sense of right and wrong, but at the same time, we shouldn't allow that or what we saw in a movie influence the way we think. These people, like us, I mean, gee, you could condemn any generation. I could say, all you people here who wear underwear made by slave labor and child slave labor in Asia, you're all monsters. Well, it's not as simple as that, but it makes you think, kind of stuff. So I think, well, as I say, keep an open mind, gather information and analyze it and form your thoughts according to what the sources reveal. But also, there's nothing wrong with interrogating the sources. I mean, if you're reading by something by somebody who says nothing wrong with slavery, okay, well, you're not going to say, well, slavery was not that bad back then because this guy says so. Well, no. Go read some of the NRA interviews with former slaves, and they'll tell you, especially if they were talking to black interviewers, how much fun being an enslaved person was, that kind of thing.
I know, see, you wrote your book on Custer, 39 years ago now. I was wondering if you would write another one today, what more information you would have.
It would sound, you know, the first book that I read was filled with boyish ebullience, and it was pretty non-critical. I mean, I dug up a lot of information from people who had served under Custer, and it was very positive. And if I did a book, it would be more based on what I said here today. Okay, let's look at some of the contradictions. Let's ask some questions. Is this merely coincidence? Was there a change of heart, or was he saying something because it was a way of saving his brigadier star? I think, you know, so I'd get into more of the messier aspects.
I appreciate that. I finished the book last year by T.J. Stiles, Custer's Triumph.
He does that, so there's really no reason.
Well, I'd love to hear more.
TJ, for him, Custer, he said to me, Custer was tremendous on the battlefield, but when he was off it, he could often be a jerk. That's the way to put it. Sure, in the back.
Good evening, sir. Compliments of Canada, Canadian soldier. I would like to, emphasize, you really want to talk about someone who was very good at killing. In the 19th century, it would have been Her Majesty Queen Victoria. She fought the entire world.
Killing was done in her name, yes.
Now, my question to you is that from Canadian history, we did not care about President Grant, especially when he did his international tour, his Canadian tour per se. We took that as it is technically an indirect invasion of Canada, again, because we had the Fenian raids at that time, you know, and he decides to come over. But my question is that there was a great possibility that the British may have armed the First Nations in order to get Lieutenant Colonel Custer defeated.
Oh, really?
Yes. You know, the British have always had their hands in every little thing around the world. Even to this day, the sun never sets. When it's setting in Jamaica, it's still up and running in Australia. Would there be a possibility that had Lieutenant Colonel Custer won in the West, he would have been President of the United States?
Yeah, been used to say why he was so eager to attack at the Little Bighorn. But you don't become president by winning a battle way off in the distant frontier without having an organization at the Democratic Convention of people who are working and trying to convince people. This guy, consider him as a dark horse if the ballot's deadlocked, etc. And then if they get good news, there's no real evidence of a political machine prepared to stampede the convention in favor of Custer. And even if he'd won a victory, there are a lot of people in the East who would not have considered that a good thing. The people living in areas where the Indians were gone were more sympathetic to them as opposed to Westerners who wanted the Indians eliminated. And a lot of the Westerners were not living in states; they were living in territories, so they wouldn't have had any say in the Electoral College. I think what drove Custer was that he was in the doghouse. He had testified against corruption in the Grant administration. Grant tried to initially kept him from going to participate in the campaign. Custer was supposed to command the entire column that came out of Fort Abraham Lincoln. And Phil Sheridan and General Terry said, we really need Custer. And Grant's getting all kinds of criticism from the Democratic press. It's a political vendetta. So Grant says he can go, but he's going to just command his regiment. He's going to be under Terry. I want him on a leash. And don't let him bring any reporters, no press. So Custer, his first Indian campaign in 1867, he cracked up and deserted his command and ran to spend some time in Libby's arms, and he was put under arrest, and he was court-martialed and suspended from rank and pay for a year, spent most of that time here in Monroe. He's in a similar situation. I think he feels, I've got to win a battle, and at least to salvage my Army career. It's hanging by a thread.
So there were 17 Canadians who actually died
Yeah.
at Little Bighorn, 2 of which were from the wealthiest families in Canada at that time, the Kellogg family and the Weiners. The soldier Kellogg was actually a journalist.
Yeah. A lot of Canadians were involved in the American Civil War. The soldier who I quoted, where he said Custer stuck his saber through the belly of rebels trying to kill him, Victor Comte, he wrote that in French. He was a French-Canadian immigrant serving in the 5th Michigan Cavalry. So yeah, the Canadian footprint on American history remains a heavy one. Yeah, thank you. If anyone, I haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, but I'm happy to tarry after this until they turn off the lights. But thank you again for your attention and again for your remarks. And I'm glad to be pushed because it makes me think about things in new ways. So, thank you.